July 1944. The suffocating hedgerow country of Normandy. Through the haze of smoke and summer heat, an American M4 Sherman crew frantically scans the narrow lane ahead. Suddenly, it appears the monstrous slope silhouette of a German Panther tank waiting like a predator in the shadows. The American commander screams an order.
They're Panthers.
The Sherman's 75mm gun cracks,
sure
sending a
about that?
shell hurtling across the field. It strikes the Panther's frontal armor
We're losing
and
too many
vanishes
tanks.
in a harmless, pathetic
It's a
spark.
slaughter.
There is a moment of dreadful silence before the reply comes. A blinding flash from the Panther's long barrel. The
Sherman's
Sherman next in
outgunned,
line
Buck.
erupts
Need
into a
new
violent
weapon
pillar of
immediately.
fire, and blackened steel, its crew incinerated in an instant.
Perhaps
Inside
if we
the
adjust the
cramped
barrel,
hulls of the
it will improve
surviving
stability.
tanks,
Yes,
terror
that's
was a
it.
physical presence. The men who had been told they were riding into battle in the workhorse of the Allied armies now understood the horrifying truth. Their tanks, produced in their thousands, reliable and fast, were becoming steel coffins. They were facing predators whose hides they could not pierce, whose fangs were lethally sharp. The M4 Sherman, the symbol of American industrial might, was being systematically slaughtered, its crews paying the price for a fatal design flaw. But this imbalance of power, paid for daily in American blood, was not the end of the story. It was the brutal catalyst for a transformation of battlefield evolution forged in fire and desperation. The answer was coming not in an entirely new tank, but in the thunderous voice of a new weapon that would finally give the Sherman the punch it needed to fight back. The scene of carnage in that Normandy lane was not an isolated incident. It was a ghastly tableau, being repeated with sickening frequency across the front. The fire from the burning Sherman cast long dancing shadows, illuminating a terrible truth that was spreading like a virus through the American armored divisions. The problem was not one of courage, nor of numbers, but of simple, brutal physics. To the men inside the M4 Sherman, this physics translated into a frantic calculus of survival, a desperate equation where their lives were pitted against the cold, hard science of steel and velocity. The crisis had a name whispered in hushed, bitter tones in maintenance depots and briefing tents: the 75mm gun. Technically, the M3 75mm cannon was a fine weapon for the war it had been designed to fight. Conceived in a pre-war era, its primary purpose was infantry support. It excelled at lobbing high-explosive HE shells that could obliterate machine gun nests, shatter bunkers, and tear apart enemy troop concentrations. For that role, it was superb. Its fatal flaw, however, was exposed when its mission pivoted from supporting infantry to killing other tanks, specifically the new generation of German heavy armor. Tank killing is a game of kinetic energy. It requires hurling a dense, solid projectile at an immense speed, concentrating a massive amount of force onto a single point to punch through hardened steel plate. The Sherman's 75mm gun, with its relatively short barrel and moderate charge, simply could not generate the required muzzle velocity. Its armor-piercing rounds left the barrel at a speed insufficient to defeat the thick, cleverly sloped frontal armor of the Panther or the sheer brute thickness of the Tiger. For the American tankers, this technical deficiency translated into a terrifying and often lethal battlefield doctrine. They learned through the hardest lessons imaginable that a head-on engagement was suicide. German panzer commanders, fully aware of their technical superiority, exploited this weakness with ruthless efficiency. Their tactics were simple and devastatingly effective. They would position their tanks at engagement ranges of 8,001,000, even 1,500 yards, well outside the effective reach of the Sherman's main gun. From this sanctuary, they could methodically pick off the American tanks. The hollow clang of a 75mm shell, harmlessly ricocheting off a Panther's glacis plate, became the prelude to the catastrophic deafening roar of an incoming 75mm or 88mm high-velocity round. The German shell would not bounce. It would slice through the Sherman's thinner vertical armor as if it were cheese, often igniting the ammunition stored inside and turning the tank into an instantaneous inferno. This grim reality earned the Sherman its infamous nickname among the troops, the Ronson Lighter, after the popular cigarette lighter's slogan, "Lights up the first time every time." This was more than a hardware problem. It was a profound psychological blow. These were young men from Ohio, Texas, and California, raised on the promise of American industrial supremacy. They had crossed an ocean, believing they were equipped with the best tools their nation could provide. Now, trapped in these steel boxes, that faith was being shattered with every lopsided engagement. A crisis of confidence began to fester. A tank crew's effectiveness is built on an aggressive spirit and absolute trust in their machine. But how could a commander confidently lead a charge when he knew his main weapon was little more than a noisemaker against the very enemy he was ordered to destroy? The doctrine that emerged was one of desperation. Use the Sherman's superior numbers and mobility to swarm the enemy to get close enough for a shot at the thinner side or rear armor. But this was a doctrine written in blood. It meant charging through a kill zone, weathering multiple shots from an enemy you could not yet harm, all for the slim chance of a flanking maneuver. For every German tank killed this way, the price was often 2, 3, or even 4 burned-out Shermans and their crews. Back at headquarters, the reports flooding in painted a picture of an impending strategic disaster. Generals like Omar Bradley and the notoriously aggressive George S. Patton were watching their armored spearheads get blunted and broken against a wall of German steel. The entire plan for the breakout from Normandy Operation Cobra relied on the rapid, decisive thrust of American armor. But that armor was being bled white in the hedgerows. The loss rates were becoming unsustainable, not just in tanks which could be replaced, but in experienced, irreplaceable crews. Intelligence had failed to adequately warn them of the sheer numbers of Panthers and Tigers the Germans would field in Normandy's defense. Now the Allied High Command was facing a stark reality. Their primary battle tank was technologically outmatched in its most critical function. The momentum of the entire invasion of Western Europe was at risk. The pressure was immense, the need was urgent, and the demand echoing from the front lines to the highest levels of command was clear and desperate. Give us a gun that can kill a Panther. The search for that weapon was no longer a matter of future development. It had become an immediate life-or-death emergency. The desperate screams from the front lines of Normandy did not fall on deaf ears. They crossed the Atlantic as frantic coded cables and landed with the force of a physical blow on the desks of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. These were the architects of America's war machine, the engineers and logisticians headquartered in the quiet halls of the Pentagon and the sprawling workshops of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They were not facing German tanks. They were facing a cascade of failure reports, casualty lists, and the horrifying prospect that their most widely produced weapon was fundamentally flawed. The pressure was suffocating. There was no time to design a new tank from the ground up. That would take years. The solution had to be an upgrade, a brutal piece of battlefield surgery performed on a living patient, and it had to happen now. The answer, it turned out, was already waiting in their arsenal, hiding in plain sight. It was a weapon born for a different purpose. The M1 76mm high-velocity gun. This cannon was the heart of America's tank destroyer doctrine, arming the fast, lightly armored M10 and M18 vehicles designed to hunt and kill panzers from ambush. Where the Sherman's 75mm gun was a generalist, the 76mm was a specialist, a dedicated killer. Its secret lay in its length and the powerful charge behind its projectile. With a much longer barrel, 52 calibers versus the 75mm 40, it acted like a massive shotgun, giving the propellant more time to burn and accelerate the shell to a furious velocity. When it left the muzzle, it wasn't just a projectile. It was a spear of hardened steel traveling at nearly 2,600 feet per second, carrying an incredible amount of raw kinetic violence. Firing this gun felt different. It wasn't the dull boom of the 75mm, but a sharp, ear-splitting crack that spoke of immense power. This was the weapon they needed. But having the weapon was one thing. Getting it into the Sherman was another. The initial attempts were a catastrophic failure. The M4 Sherman's turret had been designed around the compact, manageable 75mm gun. Trying to cram the long, heavy 76mm cannon into that same space was, as one engineer famously quipped, like trying to fit a size 12 foot into a size 8 shoe. The gun was horribly unbalanced, its long barrel making the turret dangerously nose-heavy. The recoil mechanism was bulkier, and the massive breech of the gun took up so much interior space that it left the loader and gunner with almost no room to work. In the heat of combat, where seconds meant the difference between life and death, a crew that couldn't move or efficiently load the gun was a dead crew. The project teetered on the brink of cancellation. The perfect solution was useless if it couldn't be practically implemented. It was here that the genius of American pragmatism took over. Instead of trying to force the gun into a home that wouldn't have it, the engineers decided to find it a new home. They looked to another project, the experimental T-23 medium tank, which had been developed but never put into mass production. The T-23 had a larger, more spacious, and better designed turret. It was roomier, offered better protection, and crucially was designed from the outset to handle a high-velocity cannon. In a moment of inspired improvisation, the Ordnance Department decided to mount the T-23 turret onto the existing mass-produced M4 Sherman hull. It was a hybrid, a Frankenstein's monster of a tank, but it was a solution. The new larger turret ring could be adapted to the Sherman chassis. The turret's built-in rear counterweight perfectly balanced the long gun, and its spacious interior gave the crew the room they needed to fight effectively. Even with this breakthrough, the challenges kept coming. The 76mm ammunition was longer and heavier than the old 75mm rounds, meaning the tank could carry fewer of them into battle. More alarmingly, early tests revealed a debilitating side effect. The immense muzzle blast from the high-velocity gun kicked up a colossal cloud of dust, smoke, and debris from the ground in front of the tank, completely obscuring the gunner's view for several critical seconds after firing. This made rapid follow-up shots on a moving target nearly impossible. The problem was eventually solved by adding a muzzle brake to the end of the barrel, which redirected the blast gases sideways. But it was another reminder that every solution seemed to create a new problem. The moment of truth came on the firing ranges of Aberdeen. Against the backdrop of the Chesapeake Bay, a new prototype, the M4 376 watts, rolled into position. Its target was a slab of hardened steel plate, angled and thickened to perfectly replicate the frontal armor of a Panther tank at combat range. The engineers and high-ranking officers watched through binoculars, their careers and the lives of thousands of men hanging in the balance. The order was given. With a thunderous roar that was deeper and sharper than any Sherman's before it, the 76mm gun unleashed its power. The tracer round screamed across the field, a brilliant line of light against the gray sky. There was no hollow clang of a ricochet. Instead, there was a violent, blinding flash as the shell struck the plate, followed by the sight of a shower of white-hot sparks erupting from the back of the armor. It had gone through. The weapon worked. The engineers had wrestled with physics, metallurgy, and design, and they had won. They now had a Sherman that could kill a Panther. The question was no longer if they could build it, but how fast they could get it to the front. The brilliant flash of success on the Aberdeen firing range sent a shockwave not of steel, but of pure, unadulterated hope, rocketing from the proving grounds directly to the highest echelons of the Allied command. That single successful penetration was more than a technical victory. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning army. In Washington, the atmosphere was thick with the grim reality of the Normandy campaign. Maps were covered in red markings, stalled advances, and horrifying casualty figures from the armored divisions. The clatter of teletype machines brought a relentless stream of after-action reports, each telling the same story of brave men in outgunned tanks. The success of the M4 376 watts prototype was the first piece of genuinely good news in weeks, and the decision that followed was not one of debate, but of immediate decisive action. An order stamped with the highest priority went out. It was a command that would mobilize a nation. The message was clear. The Sherman 76mm was no longer an experiment. It was the designated savior of the Armored Corps. The decision was not to halt production of the 75mm models entirely. The need for their potent high-explosive shells against soft targets was still critical, but to begin a parallel top-priority production run of the new variant. It was a strategic masterstroke of American pragmatism. The war would not wait for a perfect, singular solution. It demanded a flexible, overwhelming response. The order unleashed the full terrifying power of the American industrial heartland, an engine of creation the world had never before witnessed. This was the true beginning of the arsenal of democracy's answer to the Panzer threat. What happened next was nothing short of a modern miracle. Blueprints were flown overnight from Maryland to the industrial behemoths of the Midwest. At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant at Fisher at Press Steel Car Company, a controlled, organized chaos took hold. Massive assembly lines, which had already perfected the art of churning out tanks at an astonishing rate, began a complex and rapid retooling. The sound of American industry at war was a deafening symphony. The shriek of cranes lifting the new, heavier T-23 turrets into place, the percussive roar of 10 to 1,000 horsepower engines being tested, the staccato rhythm of rivet guns and the hiss of welding torches stitching together the hulls. This wasn't just about building tanks. It was about a national crusade fought by men and women in overalls and grease-stained uniforms. Working in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day under the stark glare of factory lights, they poured their sweat and resolve into the steel. They knew their work was not for production quotas, but for survival. Every correctly torqued bolt, every perfect weld, was a prayer for the unseen soldiers who would take these machines into the jaws of hell. A river of olive-drab steel began to flow from these factories, first a trickle, then a stream, and soon a raging flood of brand-new long-barreled Shermans. But building the tanks in Michigan was only the first chapter of a colossal logistical saga. Each 35-ton machine was a precious asset that was utterly useless until it was delivered into the hands of a crew in France. The journey began on railways, with endless trains of flat cars carrying the new Shermans eastward, thundering through the American heartland towards the bustling ports of New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. There they were greeted by another testament to American industrial might, the Liberty ships. These hastily built but rugged cargo vessels became the vital arteries of the Allied war effort. Cranes would gingerly lift the tanks, swinging them out over the water like giant slumbering beasts before lowering them into the cavernous holds. The journey across the Atlantic was the most perilous leg. These convoys were the prime targets for Germany's U-boat wolf packs. For 2 agonizing weeks, the ships would zigzag across the frigid gray ocean, hunted by an unseen enemy. A single torpedo could send a dozen of these desperately needed tanks to a watery grave, a catastrophic loss of life, steel, and time. Those that survived the crossing arrived at the hastily repaired ports of Normandy like Cherbourg, scenes of devastation and relentless activity. The tanks were unloaded onto a foreign shore that still smelled of cordite and death. But their journey was not over. They were moved to massive, sprawling ordnance depots, vast fields of mud and machinery located just behind the front lines. Here, mechanics worked in grueling conditions, preparing each tank for combat, fueling them, loading them with ammunition, and performing the final critical systems checks. It was here that the final and perhaps most crucial stage of the deployment began, the human element. The new tanks were not met with universal celebration. Veteran crews, hardened by months of combat, were creatures of habit and suspicion. They had grown accustomed to their 75mm guns. They trusted its high-explosive shell, which could blast a German machine gun nest out of a hedgerow with devastating effect. The new 76mm gun, they quickly learned, had a significantly weaker HE round. To these battle-weary soldiers, trading away their best bunker buster for a specialized anti-tank weapon seemed like a dangerous gamble. A wave of skepticism rippled through the replacement depots. It took the wisdom of grizzled ordnance officers and the brutal logic of live-fire demonstrations to change their minds. A captured Panther wreck would be towed onto a makeshift range. A skeptical crew would be ordered to fire their old 75mm at it, watching the shells spark uselessly off the armor. Then, they would climb into the new Sherman 76. They would feel the different balance of the turret, the tight space around the larger gun breech. They would aim, and the instructor would give the order to fire. The violent crack of the 76, so much sharper and more menacing than the familiar boom of the 75, would be the first sign. But the real revelation came a second later, as they watched through their periscopes and saw a flash of fire and a puff of black smoke erupt from the inside of the Panther. In that moment, all doubt vanished. Skepticism was replaced by a surge of raw predatory confidence. This gun wasn't a liability. It was their vindication. This was the weapon that would let them hunt, not just be hunted. The training was intense. Crews learned the new ballistics, the different leads required for moving targets, and a whole new set of tactics. No longer was their primary strategy a desperate suicidal charge to the enemy's flank. Now they could stand and fight. They could kill from a distance. The monumental effort was complete. The decision made in Washington had been forged into steel in Detroit, sailed across a hostile ocean, and was now being placed into the hands of men who finally had the tool they needed to exact their revenge. The stage was set for the panzers to learn a new, terrible lesson. The first M4A 376 watts Shermans arrived at the front, not with a grand parade, but as grim replacements for fallen comrades, their olive drab paint still smelling of the factory. They rolled into battered assembly areas, their long, menacing barrels immediately setting them apart from their stubbier brethren. To the exhausted, hollow-eyed veterans who gathered to see them, these tanks were more than just new machines. They were a rumor made real, a promise of retribution given steel form. A virus of confidence, potent and long dormant, began to spread through the armored divisions. It wasn't a loud, boastful arrogance, but a quiet, deadly resolve. The posture of the men changed. They walked with a renewed swagger, their movements infused with a sense of purpose that had been bled out of them in the hedgerows. They looked at their new mounts not as steel coffins, but as finely honed weapons. The psychological shift was profound and immediate. The hunted were beginning to remember how to be hunters. This newfound aggression fundamentally rewired American armored tactics. The desperate, often suicidal Sherman swarm, a tactic born of weakness, was put aside. Platoon leaders began to think not in terms of flanking and evasion, but of standoff and destruction. They drilled their crews relentlessly on the new ballistics, learning to judge ranges with a predator's eye. The doctrine shifted from get close and survive to kill them from a distance before they can kill you. For the first time, American tank commanders could look a panther in the eye across 1,000 yards of open field and feel not a knot of dread in their stomachs, but the cold, thrilling calculus of the kill. This transformation from prey to predator was about to be tested in the crucible of one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front, a clash that would become the M4 Sherman 76's brutal triumphant coming of age, the M4 C&D Farrand. Battle of Arracourt. In September, 1,944 inches, the rolling hills of the Lorraine region of France, General Patton's Third Army, was pushing hard towards the German border. The German High Command, desperate to halt the advance, planned a massive armored counteroffensive spearheaded by the 5th Panzer Army. Their primary weapon was the brand-new Panther OSF G, arguably the most advanced tank on the battlefield, crewed by a mix of hardened veterans and fresh fanatics from the Panzer training schools. They expected to smash through the American lines as they had done so many times before. Their intelligence told them they would be facing the same old Shermans with the same old pop guns. They were catastrophically wrong. Unbeknownst to them, the spearhead of Patton's advance, the formidable 4th Armored Division, had just received a fresh complement of M4 A3 76-watt Shermans. The battle began on September 19th. Concealed by a thick autumn fog, German Panther columns surged forward, their commanders arrogant and assured. They emerged from the mist, expecting to find terrified American tanks fleeing in disarray. Instead, they found death waiting for them. From concealed positions on the ridgelines, the Shermans of the 4th Armored opened fire. The German crews heard the familiar crack of a tank gun, but what followed was utterly alien. Instead of the harmless spark of a ricochet, they saw a blinding flash on their comrades' tanks, followed by the horrifying sight of black smoke and bright orange flame erupting from within. The high-velocity 76mm rounds were ripping through the Panther's side armor with contemptuous ease, and at closer ranges could even punch through the supposedly invincible frontal glacis. Panic and confusion erupted over the German radio nets. The Americans have a new weapon. They are penetrating us from the front. It's not possible. The Panzer commanders, whose entire tactical doctrine was built on their technological superiority, were paralyzed. Their greatest advantage had been neutralized in an instant. The American tankers, electrified by their success, pressed their attack with a vengeance. They used their superior numbers and the Sherman's agility, but now these advantages were coupled with lethal firepower. A symphony of destruction echoed across the fields of Arracourt. Shermans would engage from one ridge, then use their speed to race to a new flanking position, while the confused Panthers were still trying to locate their assailants. What was supposed to be a German armored blitzkrieg devolved into a chaotic turkey shoot. One American gunner, Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole, in his Sherman, named In the Mood, would destroy 12 German tanks and 258 other vehicles during his time in combat, a testament to the deadly new potential of man and machine. The results of the Battle of Arracourt were staggering and almost unbelievable. Over the course of the week-long engagement, the 4th Armored Division and its supporting units destroyed over 260 German tanks and assault guns. The 5th Panzer Army was not just stopped, it was shattered, its offensive power utterly broken. The American losses, fewer than 30 Sherman tanks. The kill ratio, which had been so horrifically skewed against the Americans in Normandy, had been reversed in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. This was not a fluke. It was a clear, undeniable verdict, delivered by fire and steel. The M4 Sherman 76mm was a panzer killer. The shockwaves of Arracourt radiated throughout the German Wehrmacht. The myth of the invincible German panzer, a core pillar of their military propaganda and their soldiers' morale, was shattered. German tank crews, who had once advanced with the confidence of medieval knights in impenetrable armor, now felt a cold sliver of fear. Every Sherman they saw was now a potential killer, not just a target. They could no longer rely on sitting back at long-range safe behind their thick armor. They had to be cautious to maneuver to expose themselves, and in doing so they became vulnerable. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand what had happened, filing reports filled with bewildered accounts of American tanks that possessed a new terrifying power. The psychological edge, which had been Germany's for so long in the armored war, had decisively shifted. The American tankers, their faith restored and their resolve hardened into a razor's edge, now had the tool they needed. They had weathered the storm, and now they were ready to unleash a whirlwind of their own as they pushed onward toward the heart of the Reich itself. The echoes of the slaughter at Arracourt resonated far beyond the shattered, smoking hulls of German armor left littering the fields of Lorraine. That victory was not an end, but a beginning. It was the brutal, thunderous validation of a philosophy, a testament to a way of war that was uniquely, powerfully American. The story of the M4 Sherman's transformation from a vulnerable target into a lethal panzer killer is more than just a tale of technical innovation. It is a profound lesson in military strategy, industrial might, and the enduring power of pragmatism over perfection. When the final history of the Second World War was written, the legacy of the Sherman 76 was not merely its kill count, but the strategic truth it represented, a truth that ultimately doomed the German war machine. At its core, the armored conflict on the Western Front was a clash between two fundamentally opposed industrial and engineering philosophies. The German approach, born from a deep-seated Teutonic pursuit of perfection, was to create technological masterpieces. The Panther, the Tiger, and the colossal King Tiger were triumphs of engineering machines designed to be the undisputed kings of the battlefield. They were over-engineered, featuring complex, interleaved road wheels, high-precision optics, and immensely powerful cannons mounted behind nearly impenetrable armor. On a one-to-one basis, they were magnificent, terrifying weapons, but they were also brittle masterpieces. They were monstrously expensive to produce, consumed vast quantities of scarce resources, and were a logistical nightmare to maintain in the field. Their complex transmissions broke down. They guzzled fuel at an unsustainable rate, and producing a single King Tiger took an astronomical number of man-hours. Germany was building the perfect weapon, but they could never build enough of them. America, by contrast, embraced a different creed. The M4 Sherman was never intended to be the perfect tank. It was designed to be a good enough tank. It was reliable, mechanically simple, easy to mass produce, and easy to repair in the field. Its strength was not in its individual supremacy, but in its overwhelming numbers and its inherent adaptability. The American philosophy was not to invent the perfect weapon from scratch, but to take a proven, reliable workhorse and relentlessly improve it. This was the very essence of incremental innovation. The Sherman 76 was not a revolution, it was an evolution, a blunt instrument that had been methodically sharpened into a scalpel. While German engineers labored over blueprints for land battleships like the Maus, which would never see combat, American workers in Detroit laid another Sherman hull on the line. The American way was to solve the problem that was right in front of them, to fix the immediate weakness, and to deploy that solution at a speed and scale that the enemy simply could not comprehend. This ability to identify a flaw, engineer a practical fix, and then mass-produce that fix was a weapon more powerful than any 88mm cannon. The strategic contribution of this philosophy embodied by the Sherman 76 cannot be overstated. It helped turn the tide in the final, most desperate chapters of the war. Its defining moment came during the brutal winter of 1,944 inches, the frozen forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler threw his last great armored reserves into one final desperate gamble to split the Allied armies. Elite SS Panzer divisions, equipped with the best Panthers and King Tigers they had left, smashed into the American lines. In the initial shock, they made terrifying gains. But they were met not by the terrified crews of 1,944 Normandy, but by battle-hardened veterans in long-barreled Sherman 76 seconds. In the snow-choked woods and fog-shrouded fields around Bastogne Street, Vith, and countless other desperate crossroads, these Shermans became the steel backbone of the American defense. They were outnumbered and often outmatched individually, but they were there and they could fight back. They formed mobile fire brigades racing to plug gaps in the line, hunting the German behemoths in deadly games of cat and mouse among the frozen pines. They were the instrument that blunted the tip of the German spear, buying precious time for reinforcements and air power to arrive. The German offensive ultimately shattered against this resilient, adaptable wall of American steel. As the Allies pushed across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany in 1945, the Sherman 76 seconds were the relentless vanguard of the final victory. They were the iron fist that supported the infantry, punching holes in the last-ditch German defenses and hunting down the dwindling number of enemy panzers. They helped ensure that the final bloody push to Berlin was as swift and decisive as possible, saving countless Allied lives by possessing the power to meet the enemy on equal terms. The Sherman, the tank once mocked as a Ronson lighter, had become the chariot of liberation. Its long gun, a symbol of an industrial and strategic power that had learned its lessons in blood and was now delivering the final crushing verdict. Ultimately, the legacy of the paddle-blade Thunderbolt and the 76mm Sherman is one and the same. It is a timeless, universal lesson about the nature of modern warfare. It teaches that victory is rarely achieved by a single wonder weapon or a stroke of theoretical genius. It is won through the accumulated weight of practical solutions, through the courage to admit a flaw and the industrial might to correct it on a global scale. It is a story about the critical feedback loop between the soldier on the front line and the engineer at the proving ground. The desperate radio calls from the hedgerows of Normandy were the catalyst for the roar of the factories in Detroit. This synergy, the ability to listen, adapt, and deploy, is the true engine of military success. The Sherman 76 sits today in museums, a silent monument of olive drab steel. But its true legacy is an invisible one, etched into the doctrines of every modern army, that in the brutal arithmetic of war, a good plan executed with overwhelming force today is infinitely better than the perfect plan that arrives tomorrow. In the final guttural sounds of the Second World War faded across a shattered Europe, the olive-drab M4 Sherman stood as one of the conflict's most ubiquitous and enduring symbols. The tanks that rolled through liberated Parisian streets and stood guard over the rubble of German cities were fundamentally different beasts from the vulnerable machines that had burned in the hedgerows of Normandy. The story of their transformation, centered on the violent crack of the 76mm cannon, is the ultimate legacy of the American war effort. It is a narrative that transcends mere metallurgy and ballistics. offering a profound lesson on the very nature of victory in modern industrial warfare. The saga of its 76mm cannon is not merely a footnote in ordnance history. It is the definitive parable of the Allied industrial and strategic triumph. The Sherman's journey from a flawed workhorse to a respected predator encapsulates the philosophical chasm that separated the Allied and Axis approaches to war. Germany, in its obsessive quest for the perfect weapon, its pursuit of technological supremacy at any cost, created magnificent predators like the Panther and Tiger. They were masterpieces of engineering designed to be invincible. But they were also fragile, complex, and produced in numbers that were tragically insufficient to alter the strategic tide. They were the product of a nation building for a decisive, perfect battle that never came. America, in contrast, embraced the power of the practical. The M4 Sherman 76 was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was a victory of evolution over revolution, of pragmatism over purity. The United States chose not to design the best theoretical tank, a process that would have taken years it did not have. Instead, it chose to build a better tank and to do so immediately, leveraging its existing gargantuan production base. It listened to the desperate cries from the front line, identified the single most critical weakness, and marshaled its continental resources to engineer a solution. This ability to adapt, to iterate, and to deploy at a scale the world had never seen was America's true secret weapon. The unbreakable chain linking the soldier in the field, the engineer at the proving ground, and the factory worker in Detroit was a force more powerful than any over-engineered Panzer. The true legacy of the Sherman 76, therefore, is not found in its final kill-to-loss ratio, impressive as it became. It is found in the lesson that wars are not won by singular marvels, but by resilient systems. It is the story of how an army faced with a crisis of confidence and a technological deficit trusted in its industrial base and its capacity for rapid innovation to solve the problem. Today, the M4 Sherman stands silent in museums and on town squares, a monument to the millions who served. But it is also a monument to an idea, a powerful testament to the unglamorous, indispensable, and ultimately victorious power of good enough, delivered in overwhelming numbers into the hands of those who needed it most, right when they needed it.